Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Club Metaverse podcast. I am joined today by the one, the only Yat Sui. Welcome to the show. It's such an honor to have you on. I'm a big fan of your work, and especially the stuff that you've been doing as of the last few years is truly groundbreaking and revolutionary. And I can't wait to have this chat with you. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
Cool. So, just I gotta ask because you're typically on the show, I'm interviewing like physicists or movie directors or writers. But and I have a few crypto folks in the mix as well. But is this the first time that you're being interviewed by a Bored Ape?
Yes, I would say it's a pretty unique experience. I kind of love it though.
All right, cool. So yeah, one thing that I've been wondering, because so many of your interviews that are out there, and I highly suggest you guys go check out all of the amazing interviews that Yat has given, some real cool insights into the world that we're getting into. But I'm very intrigued to know about your early days, about how you fell in love with video games, or kind of what's your video game story?
Well, my video game story started very, very long time ago. And I would say even before we were interacting with sort of computers or even the VCS, I was playing, with these the Trickotronics by Nintendo, the very original ones. So those are the little devices in which I sort of found a lot of time to entertain myself, and also arcades, right? So in the 70s, I was a child of the 70s. Basically, I was spending a lot of time playing in these sort of coin ops where you would put in some money and you would actually play games as well. Early
Right.
versions of Pong. So that was kind of how I grew up.
Wow.
Right. So I'm really dating myself a little bit here. The other thing also is I grew up in Vienna in Austria. That in itself wasn't a very sort of let's say techno-friendly place because it was very classic and somewhat conservative.
Yeah,
But
very
I'm also
beautiful place.
but very beautiful, absolutely. But I'm also an only child, right? So in some ways, you could say, if I think back of it as an only child, one of the ways in which I sort of entertained myself was through the digital space that was available to me, right?
Sure.
Whereas perhaps if I had maybe sort of a lot of siblings or something, they would all have kept me busy in other ways. So I think there's both the circumstance and the situation in which I found myself. And then I was generally drawn. I mean, which kid doesn't like video games? I actually can't think of many kids in the world that, given the opportunity to play video games, whatever generation they were, wouldn't actually want to do that. So, my interest in the space really started organically from being entertained by it, really.
And do you remember what the game was that gave you that inspiration? Because when I was a kid and I played, for me it was Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. It was this game by LucasArts back in the day that was able to really do an amazing job in telling a story. And I was like, that's when it all clicked to me, like, wow, storytelling in video games as a medium is a really powerful device. Was there that one game that you remember saying, okay, this is the game that's inspiring me to potentially try to make this a career?
So, I didn't enter the gaming space or the tech space, as it were, through games. Right. So, I loved games, but I didn't. It started with music really because I had a
Oh,
music
wow.
background, and what happened was is that so my parents were professional musicians, and so they made me study music in Vienna, which is extremely competitive and certainly
Oh,
humbled.
yeah.
It certainly humbled me a lot in the sense that I certainly
Right.
understood what true talent was like, and I
Yeah,
was not.
yeah.
I was not that, right?
Right.
So I
It's like playing football in Ohio. It's like, yeah,
Yeah,
music in Vienna. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
right. It was tough, right? But I ended up basically using a computer at the time that I had was an Atari ST, and it had MIDI
Sure.
ports, and I basically made MIDI software. Took an early version of that basically allowed me to compose faster than my peers,
Wow.
which is basically like a calculator in math, right? Really, if you think about it. And my teachers were not amused because basically they thought I was cheating. But
Right.
I got appreciation for the software on a pre-internet service called CompuServe.
Mm.
And so people basically started saying, "Hey, we like the software," and then over, in due course, people started sending me money as well, in the mail, which is kind of how people used to sort of reward software developers by literally sending checks in the mail, and that eventually led me to be discovered by Atari. So my sort of the beginning of that didn't really start off in. I love to play games. Let me get into the industry, because in the 80s,
Interesting.
there wasn't really a gaming industry per se. And also in Austria, there were no gaming studios that I could work for anyway. And I was a
Sure.
kid. I just kind of morphed into that space. And then when I was working at Atari, then I got involved in sort of the world of first in multimedia and then in gaming. And sort of one of the sort of last devices that I had the privilege, or maybe misfortune, I don't know which way you want to look at it,
Mm,
working on was the Jaguar,
mm.
right? And the Jaguar was sort of Atari's last attempt to basically be a console player
Yeah,
back
yeah,
in the
yeah.
early days, as a sort of quasi 32-bit player, or 64-bit player to be precise, to compete with, Sega and Nintendo. Anyway, that was sort of that. So I wouldn't say, even though I loved games, it wasn't the one game that said, "Oh my goodness, I should
Sure,
do this."
sure.
I just
So,
kind of morphed into it.
yeah, your entry point was this kind of fascination with the Atari ST and MIDI and understanding the engineering side. So back then, obviously, engineers were a hot commodity or a rare commodity, and
Hmm.
you got your insight through that. So did you ever work with oh my God, I keep thinking Bruno Bonnell, but not Bruno Bonnell, the original founder of Atari.
Oh, Nolan Bushnell? No,
Nolan Bushnell. It
no.
sounds
So
familiar. Yeah, it
yes,
sounds. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So
It
so no.
rhymes.
So Nolan. He was. So what happened was, is if you look at the history of Atari, he built Atari, the coin-op machines. In fact, I think there's even the story that Steve Jobs used to have sort of worked there for a little bit as well. But that was not
Yes.
my generation. I would probably have to be born in the '60s to have experienced that, right? So I'm a little
Gotcha.
bit too
Gotcha.
late. However, he ended up selling it to Warner. And
Mm.
then actually Warner kind of made a mess of it all. And then they sold it to, Atari had many histories. And then they ended up selling it to the Tramiels. And the interesting story for those who follow a little bit of computer history is the Tramiels had just basically come out of a very acrimonious relationship with the shareholder, or the primary shareholder, who was running another company called Commodore.
Oh
And
God, my
if
favorite.
Yeah, so if you remember back in the day, there were the Atari Commodore wars, right? And it
Yeah.
really started because sort of the Tramiels basically had really built up a sort of Commodore and what was the Commodore 64. And then with this new technology, which was the Commodore Amiga, there was this amazing technology which became one of the biggest PC gaming stations back in the
Oh my
80s,
God.
right? If you remember,
Of
and
course. Of
and
course.
and that, so there was this fast reaction to basically sort of compete with that, with what became the Atari ST, and with the sort of some of the original engineers of the Commodore 64, right? So they actually had similar roots around that. And so he basically acquired, I guess, the what would have been considered fairly defunct assets of Atari in a very shrewd business move. And then really began what, for people in the 80s, were sort of the early forms of the computer wars between Amiga and Atari.
Yeah.
Those were the old days.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Those are the good old days. And similar to you, I was obsessed with the idea of being able to work with the Amiga. I couldn't afford one. I had a Commodore 64, so I was familiar with the Amiga. I um I didn't, I couldn't afford it because at the time it was an expensive machine.
Yeah.
So I actually went to a local television station in Miami where I grew up, and I told them that I knew how to use the software Video Toaster, even
Yes,
though
that's
yes,
right.
even though I did not know how to use a software Video Toaster. And then, like, when I got to the interview, they were like, "Here's the Amiga. Can you show me how to do Video Toaster?" And I knew enough about reading all like the stuff and like Commodore magazine and all that stuff that I was able to actually kind of fool my way around it enough where I got a job editing for this television station on the Video Toaster because nobody else knew how to use it. So so yeah. And then of course when nobody was looking, I would install Defender of the Crown by
Oh my
Cinemaware.
goodness, that was one of the first. Actually, I played that on the Commodore 64. In fact,
Yeah,
yeah, that
yeah,
was a classic. And then of course Atari ST had a version as well. But yeah, the Amiga always was superior in terms of its graphics and its capabilities. But we were sort of, back then it was really passionate. It's almost like if you were, a Commodore Amiga guy, you just simply couldn't cross over to the Atari side and vice versa. It was, almost religious in terms
right.
of the passions that people had. It was kind of, as you say, the good old days.
Yeah, and like it's really interesting that you say that actually because at that age I learned one of the most important lessons in my life. And my grandfather for Christmas said, "Hey, I'm going to buy you a console, this year for Christmas." And it was either the the NES or the Sega Master System, right? Like that was the choice. And like I kept on going either or, like NES. I kept on going back and forth at Toys R Us. And my grandfather told me something I'll never forget. That's probably the most important thing I've ever learned in my life, which is that he said it's not. He said it in Spanish, but it's not about either or. It's about both and. And he surprised me, and he bought me both of them.
Wow,
You know. So ever since then, I've always had both. Never one or the other. It's always both. So
awesome.
Very important thing that it's not about picking sides. Sometimes it's about learning about everything.
Yep. Agreed.
So okay, so cool. So what was that transition like between working at a company like Atari that that was such a big brand name and kind of evolving into an entrepreneur? How did your entrepreneur story kind of get started?
So the entrepreneur started really when Atari went bust, or at least went bust in the format that we knew, right? Basically, what happened was through some corporate engineering, I think the Tramiels basically just sort of threw in the towel and said, this is not going to work for us, and basically sold themselves off to a hard drive company. I think it was called JTS. Anyway, it was a bit of a shock, right? At that point, I was actually studying in the US because I didn't have a formal computer science education. And they said, oh, hey, you need to sort of, brush up on your sort of CS skills because we didn't have that in Austria. I said, sure, no problem. So halfway through when I was basically studying and working, it was like, oops, my employer is no longer here. What do I do, right? And they dissolved the office in Europe, basically headquartered in Germany, which is basically where, the sponsorship came from. Everything was just a mess, right?
Sure.
So that was, back then, how do you become an entrepreneur? Well, in most cases, because you're unemployed. And that's basically what happened to me. We basically formed a company, 6 of us, to really support the infrastructure of really on the media side for ex-Atari people. And if you remember back then, if you buy a computer, you don't swap it out every 6 to 12 months, right?
Right.
You keep it for a very long time, and
Yeah.
you want support, and nobody was able to provide support. So we ended up basically providing a form of software and services support by updating software, by creating patches, by
Oh, wow.
by doing stuff where you kind of like a I guess like a plumbing service for your Atari computer, if you will.
Right.
And then you need some new software upgrades. We would build software that was mostly sort of visual arts related, and that was the beginning of that virtual career, as an entrepreneur. And what was interesting at that point in time is that actually I had only really met one person in that company in person. Everyone else, we communicated
wow.
entirely over CompuServe and then eventually Genie, because travel was expensive and long distance calls were just not feasible because it's just super expensive back then, right? You charge by the minute, right? So it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So we started that business, and then eventually it morphed into Atari was going to be a declining business, so it was good in the beginning, but long term it wasn't going to work because nobody's making new Atari computers, so you're not going to get any new customers. And as you may also recall, that's when PCs started to really emerge, right?
Right. The
And at that point,
286.
yeah, exactly. And then eventually 386s and 486s, and then you had better graphics. And at that point, none of the old computers that we knew, the Amiga and or even new renditions of it could compete. And so we ended up basically sort of moving over to basically building tools on SGI. And what was interesting is because we had expertise in 3D graphics and rendering, we basically built OpenGL modelers. And what that meant was that we basically had a way in which we could create a 3D model, in OpenGL, which was then used as a platform for SGI called VRML, so virtual reality markup language. It was kind of
of course.
SGI.
I remember it well.
Yeah, SGI's answer to HTML to say we're going to go shopping online in VR with these line graphics that look like Tron.
Oh, I remember it. I remember it. I'm one of those guys that told everybody in my studio, "Hey, let's get into VRML." Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
right. So this was in the early '90s, right? And so we built basically one of the very first modeling tools that basically would output in VRML, which eventually led us to being acquired by SGI. And because back then SGI was really trying to compete as being the next internet machine, and because they were losing out to Sun Microsystems, and so they bought many companies and cobbled them together in what is was known as SGI WebForce.
Wow.
And so this was one of the many components that made SGI WebForce, and they basically acquired us. And since I was the only that was also my first sort of entry into Asia, because as the only Asian member of the team, They're like, hey, you're Asian, international business plan. Let's go to Asia. I'm like, sure, no problem. I don't care. I'm single and I'm like, unattached. So let's go. And my first posting was Japan. So that's kind of how that all
Wow.
started.
First
And
of all, it's
then
fascinating. I had no idea that's quite the journey. Did you already speak Japanese
no,
when?
no, no, no. I grew up in Austria. German is my mother tongue. I mean, obviously I have an Asian heritage, but if you know anything about history, it's not a likely thing to send a Chinese ethnic person to Japan, right?
Right, right, right.
But it didn't matter, right? It was more like that was how the world was, right? In terms of, and it's crazy to think that at the time sending someone overseas, even as developed as Japan or Hong Kong was at the time, was considered hazardous, right? So
Sure.
nobody wanted to go. So I was the only one who was like, sure, let's go, right? And so anyway, I went to Japan for a few months. I trained people on how to use the software. Then I went to Taiwan, and then I ended up being in Hong Kong, and that was
Mm,
kind of interesting because in Hong Kong, I was sort of doing what I was doing before, but I couldn't get my email because there wasn't a CompuServe node. And that
mm,
was kind of like, and at that point, AOL was really sort of becoming all the rage in the US. And I thought, well, you know what? Because my father's from Hong Kong, I ended up getting a Hong Kong permanent identity card, which basically meant that I have the right of abode and I could live there and I didn't need a visa. So I thought, why don't I stay here and build, one of the very first internet service providers in Hong Kong.
oh wow.
And that was kind of how that all started. And I think it was really hard as a business because nobody wanted internet. It was like I felt like it was selling sort of fridges to Eskimos because because it was like what I need is for,
Right.
and also it was a remarkably underwhelming experience when you actually got to see it, right? And I remember, we were using Mosaic browsers before we moved on to Netscape, right? It was all very, very primitive. But for me, it was just kind of natural. It was like, hey, this is the place we want to be. I was playing multi-user dungeon games. I was on
Of
MUDs.
course.
I was setting up my own IRC chats, right? I was doing all this stuff, and I was making relationships and connections and friends in those spaces. But of course, all of us were equally broke, so we couldn't really support each other in terms of building the business. So on one hand, we had this sort of community that was really forming and growing. On the other hand, it was almost impossible to commercialize it, right?
That's
Um,
incredible.
but yeah, that's how my entrepreneurial journey started. And fast forward a little bit, basically,
Sure.
the dot com wave basically became really, really a big thing in the US, and there were a number of US companies at that point who were really trying to sort of acquire traffic, and it was
Hmm.
getting expensive. We're talking now 97, 98 type of thing. And
Yep.
so they looked for companies, and at that point we had 300,000 users on our sort of, at that point we were not really an ISP anymore. We were more like a sort of a GeoCities equivalent, but for Asia.
And
uh,
at this point, sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
but at this point, you're the CEO of the company.
Well, I'm the founder of the company.
Sure.
I never gave myself a CEO title.
Gotcha.
That happened much, much later. And frankly, it was also a little bit like, I felt almost a little bit sort of an imposter syndrome in terms of how could I possibly be a CEO at like, 20 or 21 or whatever age I was at the time, and then later on. So I never called myself CEO, even with companies that I had formed thereafter. I didn't actually give myself an executive title until
Sure.
maybe when I hit my 30s. But anyway, they acquired the business. What was interesting there is I got some money. I didn't get all the money I thought I was going to get because the whole thing just kind of, the whole .com thing sort of blew up. But it allowed
Yeah.
me to get sort of some money to build what is now known as Outblaze, which is really an early cloud computing platform,
Yeah. Yeah.
for email. And that kind of really was sort of, the basis of sort of building a business that ultimately ended up getting acquired by IBM almost a decade later. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that something because I've been very lucky in my entrepreneurial career. Nothing to the scale of what you've done, but in my own context, it's, I'm proud of my achievements. And one of the things that I always tell young entrepreneurs when I meet them is that when you have a business, that to really think of that as, exit strategy. Like if you're going to build something, know what the exit is, unless you're committing to it for the rest of your life, which is an option as well. Is that something that you learned, or is that something that just kind of happened naturally, or were you conscious about the idea of building value that's attractive to other industries?
So I never thought of it in terms of exit originally, and I would say I still don't, because it's like if I was thinking about building it for exit, let's say my very first internet service provider business, which is called Hong Kong Online, by the way. So it
Hmm.
just gives it, and I was able to get the trademark and registrations for that too. Gives you
That's
an idea
cool.
of how early that was. I probably wouldn't have built that business
Right.
because logically speaking, when I was setting up an ISP in Hong Kong, market demand was close to zero, awareness was low. It was like it was like like the earliest of fringes of the innovator stage, which
Right.
typically is the death valley. And so actually, if I was thinking logically, I would have had a much better business if I actually started an ISP probably 4 years later, right?
Right.
Just because of
Right.
because timing matters in these matters. But for me, it was more like it just felt right for me. It was like, hey, this is a space I'm excited in, so I started building in the space, and that's kind of how I started doing this. So everything I did, and I do has been a commitment as if I would do it forever.
Right.
And but then you get savvy, you look at the market, you look at circumstances. So when Outblaze was sold to IBM, it wasn't because we were planning to sell it to IBM. IBM actually came
Sure.
to us. What happened was is at that point the market was consolidating, right? Gmail was everywhere. Microsoft had just launched 360 online. We were still one of the largest independent email service providers, but you had to look at the reality and say, okay, we offer these enterprise services to, at that point, like ISPs in the US, like Verizon and Juno Online and all those, register.com and network solutions, many of them that are not around anymore, right? And
Right.
we're sort of like, okay, where do we find ourselves? And then IBM needed a solution to combat essentially the growth in sort of cloud applications. And so we were sort of the natural fit, but there wasn't really many other buyers out there necessarily as well, right? So I would say again, we were lucky to an extent, but also we didn't build it out for an exit, at least in this circumstance.
Hmm.
And that's partially also because the region Hong Kong where we built the business wasn't really a VC friendly place.
Interesting.
Even though there's a lot of capital here, it's not really for technology investing. You don't normally hear about too many tech companies emerging out of Hong Kong, certainly from that generation, because you also had a much more attractive and sexier neighbor that was China, right? So
Right.
if you're going to invest in technology, why would you invest it in Hong Kong? You invested in China, the chances of returns and success are much greater, right? So that was kind of all of these things that you learn later on. So I would say that we have to be, of course, market aware, and we have to sort of
Mm.
go roll with the punches, and maybe you have to be opportunistic in terms of where things are, just to make sure that you sort of are, and you need to be somewhat paranoid as to where the market is, so you have to be always on your toes. But my philosophy certainly hasn't been to build towards an exit, and but it ends up happening. And sometimes, like when the first generation of Animoca was built, after IBM was sold, I sold the business to IBM. We had a non-compete in enterprise.
Hmm.
We basically and we had actually a gaming business in Outblaze, which is doing MMO games and console games. So that eventually
Really?
became, yeah, that was, so we did sort of, our most infamous title was a game called Hello Kitty Online. If you
Ooh, I
can,
never heard about that one. I never
yeah.
heard. I love
Anyway,
MMOs. I never heard about
yeah.
that one.
Anyway, Hello Kitty Online is one of those games that a lot of people joke about because they're like, wait, that's why would you turn Hello Kitty into sort of like a World of Warcraft? That's kind of how the connections people made back when we were looking at hyper casual. This is like in 2005 and 2006 or something, like a long time
Right.
ago. Anyway, sort of fast forward a little bit, we ended up we had a gaming division, and IBM was like, I don't know what to do with the gaming division. We're not in that space, so we carved it out and sold the enterprise assets to IBM and kept the gaming piece. And with that, we actually ended up basically moving very quickly into mobile games and free to play, and sort of became one of the biggest players in 2011. Before we got deplatformed from the App Store, which is another story altogether. But
Right. It sounds like an
yeah,
interesting one.
but one of the things that happened, and I guess this is just how I operate, is that
Yeah.
around 2014, 2015, Animoca Brands, basically spun out of what was the original Animoca, which is the gaming piece that I was just talking about, and started going into sort of kids gaming, which was very difficult at that
Mm.
point. I was a little disillusioned from the gaming industry myself, so I was there, but I was actually no longer operating the business.
Interesting.
I actually went into ed tech. I helped build a school. I built a learning lab. I had young children too. That certainly has influenced my decision making. But I think
Sure.
the one thing that got me in the gaming space was, what attracted me was to the fact that it was fun and entertaining and we bring joy to people. And what it became, and this is around 2014, 2015, what it
Mm.
became was really a business about how to extract as much money from the player as possible. And it
Sure.
became very exploitative, actually. And on top of the exploitation, we were no longer building games that were best for the users. We were
Right.
building games that were best for the platform.
Yeah, yeah,
Basically,
yeah.
Apple was like, "Oh, we have an AR feature. We'd like you to build that feature because if you don't, well, maybe we can't feature you."
Sure,
It's like,
sure.
and of course they don't say it that way, but it's implied, right? And so our entire marketing effort and our entire relationship literally became around offering, and bearing gifts to the king, right?
Mm,
And I was like, wait a second, I entered the internet space. I built the ISPs. We were one of the biggest open source deployments, back in the Outblaze days, back in the sort of late 90s and early 2000s. And this was all supposed to be open, right?
mm.
AOL failed. Even the sort of Chinese internet that was supposed to be closed ended up having to allow for open source and sort of that information to flow in and out, right? So open was supposed to win. And then here
Mm.
we are living in these closed ecosystems, trying to extract as much value out of the users
It's
without
very
giving anything
true.
back. And so while I didn't understand exactly, I didn't have an answer to this, but it felt draining. Like and so I guess again, it felt like this is not where I want to be. This doesn't make sense. So I became a director of the company in a sort of non-executive role, which is why for a long time I had a non-executive capacity for a couple of years, and started going into education and learning, and learned a whole bunch of
Mm.
new things that actually really have informed sort of my view of where the world is going from my perspective. But it helped me sort of, I guess, find myself a little bit in terms of where I think the world needs to go. I was working with children and all that. It's a completely different perspective, and then when through actually what was originally a personal investment, in the company called Fuel Powered, that was
Mm.
basically sharing an office with another company called Axiom Zen, building this little thing called CryptoKitties.
Oh
Uh,
wow.
right,
Wow, you were, oh my God.
yeah,
I did not know that piece of the story.
yeah, that is when sort of sparks started flying, right? And we're just like, oh, this is interesting, right? And and that's kind of when everything started coming about. Like we could reconstruct everything through the way it should be through this paradigm because we can really own our digital assets. And so really, the Animoca brands today was effectively born from that moment, which is basically late 2017.
Obviously I've been, I bought my first Bitcoin when it was $9 in 2013. So I've been around.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So I've been around, from not from the beginning, but early on. And, when I bought Ethereum very early as well. And everybody was looking for that Ethereum use case that actually had, liquidity of users to it. And when we all realized, I think that the only one that had any real usage was CryptoKitties, I think is when Ethereum had that first big crash,
Hmm.
because it's like everybody had all these ICOs, but ultimately only CryptoKitties had users, and
Yeah.
and that's what I tried. I pitched Star Trek on an NFT game. I pitched everybody on an NFT game back in those days because I was like, NFTs are the way to go. And fast forward 2 years later, now NFTs are like everything. But so first of all, I'm blown away because you were early on CryptoKitties, but you're also early on Axie Infinity, correct?
Yes.
Weren't you the
Correct.
first lead
We were
investor
the
in?
first lead investor in Axie. That's correct.
Yeah, which is mind blowing thing. And for folks that aren't super familiar with Axie Infinity, I believe Axie Infinity has the higher level of usage when it comes to any NFT game out there in terms of like being the quote unquote World of Warcraft game in terms of its actual player base is quite substantial. How did you know? Like, how did you spot that Axie had a lot of potential? Like what were some of those hallmarks?
Well, I mean, first of all, when we started building in a space, which is late 2017 and obviously 2018, there weren't a lot of us building, as you probably know, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we were literally an echo chamber of people drinking our own Kool-Aid, very desperate to sort of validate that we actually think we're right, because
Yeah,
obviously,
yeah. I wish I would have had a sip of that Kool-Aid. I wish I would have had
right.
this conversation with you back then.
Yeah, but anyway, and so we really sort of, if you think about it, we're a very small, tight knit community of people who knew each other, right?
Mm,
And that led ultimately to our construction. At that point, we were a publicly listed company in Australia, And when we decided this is the future of gaming and this is the future, where we think the whole internet should be going, we should double down. We made a conscious decision that we can't be the ones that control it. In fact, it would be antithetical to the principles of
Mm,
blockchain, or what we now define as Web3 or the open metaverse. Instead, we have to basically help build these businesses, and that led us basically to acquiring the Sandbox, to investing in Axie Infinity or in
mm.
Sky Mavis, into OpenSea, into Wax, Decentraland,
Right.
Bitsky, and like all these companies. Most of these investments were in 2018 and 2019. So very,
Right.
very early on, and these are all seed companies. These were all startups that had like 5 or 10 people or something, right?
Sure.
And
Sure.
now, what was it particularly about the Sky Mavis team in Vietnam that was attractive to us? Well, one, they're passionate about what they're building.
Mm.
Two, they came from a CryptoKitties background, in the sense that they were trading and playing CryptoKitties, and saw
Oh,
the potential,
interesting.
right? So
Interesting.
that was their inspiration. But they wanted to basically build a CryptoKitties that had sort of real utility, as opposed to just CryptoKitties for collecting.
Sure.
So that was another part of that. And then I think their perception and their perspective of the world was one that we shared, which is about open frameworks and decentralization and all these things, which, by the way, not everyone shared, certainly at that point in time, right?
Sure.
Because to build in what we now describe as Web3 is very different than to be trading in it. And the world
Right.
in 2018 and 2019 was still dominated by crypto traders who were there for speculation. And so they didn't care about DEXs. They didn't care really about the principles of what it meant to build on sort of an open, sort of decentralized ledger. It was more like, how much money can I make? And therefore, trading on exchanges like Binance or Coinbase, that was really where they were. But they didn't really understand what was happening. It was really just about making a quick buck. Those were the people, like the people who were building Sandbox, or people who were building, Axie Infinity or OpenSea or so on. They were really working through a time when our industry was probably on its knees, right?
Right.
Bitcoin was $3,000, Ether was below 100, right?
Right. Right.
Everyone was running away from fungible tokens, and then here we are saying, have you heard of non-fungible ones? They trade
Right.
less, and you should invest in this, right?
Right. Right.
Right? It seems sort of very strange that someone should be interested in this, and so it was. Very few were. So we were a small club of people. So and I would say that interests attract counterparties, right?
Yeah.
If so, it's not like we sought out them. We sought each other out, right? Because we were,
Mm.
we were in conferences, and we would just meet with each other, or we would connect to people who were connected to us, because we were all kind of similar thinking of the space, and we were only hundreds of people at the time, so it was very easy. Today, that's different, right? Today, it seems like every other day or every day, new NFT gaming projects are emerging. It's
Sure.
harder to determine sort of what the motivations are, but certainly, in 2018, 2019, if you were building in this space, you had to be a hardcore believer. You had to be passionate about this, because it wasn't
Right.
about making money right now. Because if you were going to try to make money, you could do it in different ways easier.
Right, right. It wasn't the manifest destiny of like, oh, let's mint a bunch of NFTs and say that, we have a metaverse game. Like that's a very interesting point. And I want to reflect on that for a second, just for myself. But basically what I'm hearing is that the kind of filtration that you went through to make all these investments, was really based on an underlying philosophy of wanting to create value for the user versus the concept of extracting value, which was the whole thing about social gaming, was microtransactions, these two kind of trends that were going on, just before this era kind of started.
Hmm.
And you were trying to really find philosophically people that were trying to engineer gaming products that were about like creating value for the user, which
Correct.
is which is actually very,
Correct.
very, interesting. And to me, it's actually my favorite thing about the space is, I was a big World of Warcraft player. I was a big Star Wars Galaxies player, and I paid like $800 for my Jedi. Yes, I did buy a Jedi, but I got very good at using it. But I'm not gonna lie, I did buy a Jedi, and I paid like $800 for a Jedi once. And I had friends that would also buy Jedi, but then they got busted, and then they would get like blacklisted from ever playing the game again. Same thing with Warcraft, right? If
That's right.
you bought gold from wowgold.com or whatever, and they caught you, you would get your account banned. You would have to start all over again. Where it's like now the idea is no, we actually are encouraging the concept that, something that you say, and I'm paraphrasing a quote from you, that it's not about renting the gaming experience, it's about actually owning the gaming experience. And to me, that is a paradigm shift, that, Godzilla's out of the cage. It's like,
That's right.
sooner or later that will overtake the entire industry. And I'm glad.
Yes, and one interesting anecdote on this is when we launched, so we became publishers of CryptoKitties and also investors very early, right? And one of the partnerships in 2018 that we did, which was, if you think about it, very forward thinking, maybe too early, was a partnership with HTC where we bundled CryptoKitties with a blockchain phone at the time, right?
Oh,
And
nice.
that phone obviously didn't do as well as perhaps we had hoped, but that's the industry at the time. But
Yeah.
what was fascinating is when they said, okay, well, we need to pair at least two CryptoKitties because you have to breed, right? And we're like, okay, so just send us a CryptoKitties. Well, we can't just send it to you. We have to buy it on market, right? What do you mean we have to buy it on market? Because we can't just produce it. And it was
Right.
at that point, it was like roughly $15 per pair of CryptoKitties, which
Right.
basically would add $15 of cost to the phone, right? It was kind of it was interesting where
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
having these conversations to say, and then who do you buy those from? We don't buy it, we don't make it. We buy it from the other players who had already bred these CryptoKitties, right?
Sure.
So that was, and really we had to listen and collaborate with our players from day one because they were the asset owners and we were building experiences for them, versus we control everything and we decide your destiny thereafter and forever.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One thing that I've really been impressed with listening to your talks online is your way to articulate these ideas that people throw around like buzzwords, like the way people use the word love or freedom or peace. Like they have no idea what any of those things mean. How would you define Web3?
Web3 to me is the internet of ownership, I would say, in a very simple term. And I think the foundation of Web3 comes with the fact that we have true digital property rights.
Mm-hmm.
The foundation of digital property rights means that we can now freely and openly compose on top of the ownership of others, which is how human invention and innovation has always taken place, right? It is also the reason how we defend our democracies, actually, if you think about it,
Mm.
right? And why was a democracy even created in the first place? Because it was essentially a revolt of the kings and queens out there who basically ruled our
Mm.
life. And so we needed to have a framework that allowed us to essentially have the majority interest protected to the benefit of all. Because what ultimately happens is that if a small group of people get to benefit, maybe not in the beginning, as they say, maybe some of the first kings and dictators are benevolent, but as it goes over
Right,
generations,
right, right,
ultimately what happens is that power corrupts, right? Because
right.
you no
Absolutely.
longer you no longer think about sort of the interest of the majority that actually may have even brought you here. You're thinking simply about protecting your particular interest and the interest of the minority, which in the past might be the nobility or the landowners or whatever you want to
Mm.
call it, right? And usually that ends up creating an unequal outcome, which repeats itself in history, typically in the forms of revolution and other sort of unfortunate outcomes, because people say enough. Because at the end of the day, you can't suppress the majority forever, right? So that's kind of and property rights is the defensive mechanism around this because it keeps everything honest and open, but also it's a reason and it's the engine of growth. If I can't own a house, then I can't get a mortgage for 20 or 30 years, for instance, right? If
Right.
I, and if we don't all own cars, for instance, in a decentralized private way, then the business of an Uber or Lyft cannot be created, right? Because
Mm.
I have to seek permission from Tesla or from Volkswagen to be able to do that. And what's interesting also is that the framework of owning is actually the reason why economies become greater and bigger. It's the new innovation angle. If you look at the sales of the car, it's actually a small part of the automotive industry. The automotive industry, when you include, the construction of roads or parking lots or the fuel or the gas stations or the drivers that are hired or Uber or Lyft or, car wash companies, like if you include the industry that sort of makes automotives work, it's multiple times larger than the sale of the car itself. So,
Mm.
which means we've added layers of new experiences and innovation on top, and we can do that because we have ownership. I can do it on a peer-to-peer basis. The fact that I can own an iPhone allows for a Casetify business to emerge, that I can basically decorate the phone. or have headphones
Right.
or headsets, right? If I have to seek permission every time from Apple to do that, what's Apple going to do? They're going to say, well, if you want to put a headphone that works with Apple, I got to charge you 30%, right?
Right.
And by the
Right.
way, I don't like that design. That doesn't look good. I got to approve it first, like every other app I approve.
Sure.
Therefore, please make sure it's got nice sort of Apple logos, and it has to be white, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and anytime, any environment where you have, where everything is permissioned, innovation basically stifles. And there's a parallel in real life. A country that has strong property rights, that is protected, right, in this case through law, is a very strong economy. The GDPs are higher. In the
Mm.
countries where property rights are not defended, or don't exist, they become like North Korea, basically places that have
Sure.
have very low GDPs and very low rights overall. And I go to the next point, which is that when you own something as an end user, as an individual, then you care to protect it and you care to
Mm.
invest in it. It's like emotionally, it's like if I rent a house, how much would I invest in it? I make them useful and whatever. I put the bed in, but I'm not going to make a whole blown renovation because I'm going to be here only for 2 years, right?
Mm.
Maybe 4 years, right? But if I'm actually living in this place for what I think would be a long time, if I'm investing in it, if I'm owning it, then I'm going to make more of an investment. And that's how we treat everything that we own versus everything that we rent. And
Mm.
which means also we care. We care much more for what we own than we care what we rent. And in
Mm.
the digital world, it's the same. So, some of the game companies are saying, how is it possible that, a game like Axie Infinity or even Crazy Defense Heroes, which is now powered by the Tower token, has, retention rates that are like crazy high, like 30, 40, 50, or 70% in some cases, right? Vis-a-vis the traditional games, which have like single digit low percentage of retention. Well, that's
Mm.
because in the traditional games, we're all renters. I have nothing holding me back. I don't own anything. So I can just switch from one game to another game to another game with zero switching costs and with zero sort of reasons to not go from one place. So the only attraction is the UX. But with where I have ownership, I now have a vested